hope it was insightful. I hope you got what we're preparing for the community. And now it's time to have on stage someone who was at the first Apidays conference 10 years ago. 10 years ago, we were in a small computer science school outside of Paris. You know, it was just a Google Groups. I invited some people, say, let's connect, right? Most of them never met. They were just following each other on Twitter, or they were just like on these API craft Google Groups. And so, yeah, we decided to say, okay, let's try to connect. And people came from all over the world to connect in Apidays, which is a French computer science school. And so sometimes they say, hey, actually you look taller than on Twitter, or smaller and everything, or on shorter, right? So that was really funny. So Mike Amundsen was one of these first speakers. He made a talk about the 50 years of what happened the last 50 years at the time. And so 10 years later, he may have something to tell us about what happened in the last 60 years and what led us to understand for the next 10. So I will ask you a warm applause for Mike Amundsen. Thank you. I'll let you connect.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Mike.
Okay. Hello. Hello. Oh, I feel better. Okay. Get this technical part out of the way here. Get started. Okay, let's see if we're really broadcasting. Yes? Oh, okay, very good. All right. Okay, so it's wonderful to be here. Yeah, yes, I was here 10 years ago, not actually here, but 10 years ago with API Days, and apparently I keep coming back. I don't know what my problem is, but I'm very, very happy to be here. So I wanted to talk a little bit about 60 years rather than 50 years. We'll talk about 60 years of APIs, but I wanted to do it in a slightly unusual way. I wanted to talk about it from the perspective from here, what I've seen over the last 10 years. First of all, this is me. This is how you find me on GitHub and LinkedIn and YouTube and Twitter, and yes, Mastodon as well, and we'll talk a little bit about that by the end of my talk here today. This is my latest project that I just finished. This is a book on patterns and for APIs. It's a rather large book. It's about 500 pages, so I couldn't bring very many copies, but I have lots of free preview cards. So if you want to see me this week, I'll be here all week. Just stop me, and I'd be happy to give you a preview card on this new book from O'Reilly. So I mentioned that I would really like to talk about the last 10 years. So let's start with Paris. Let's start with Paris in 2012. As Mehdi was saying, we met over in a set of classrooms. I have a few blurry photos from that very same event 10 years ago. There was there's actually a bit of a display of lots of events, but these are the very first ones that we saw, and I can't really tell you too much about them other than I think I was there. And it was, just as Mehdi said, it was a great experience, people meeting up and getting to know each other really, really well. In fact, here's a younger me, a more optimistic me, a less gray me, talking about this talk that we're just mentioning 50 years ago. As a matter of fact, as I look at this, let's see if I can kind of, is it like, no, is this way? This way, like this? You know, if this was the Hollywood movie, there'd be some harp music right now and some wavy lines, and then we would all be transported to 10 years ago, and we'd be in that moment, right, 10 years ago. So, wait, does anybody hear any harp music? Well, I was kind of hoping that, you know, we would actually all be transported. That would make it a whole lot easier. I kind of really thought a lot ahead about, you know, my life in the movies. I even thought, you know, there'd be a little bit of time travel here that we can all experience, and I would be played by George Clooney, right? George Clooney is a fellow Kentucky. We both live in Kentucky, so I thought that would be pretty good. George, see, it even says, a man ready to make a connection, right? That's good, right? No? Then maybe we'd have a team. We'd go out and, you know, solve the world's API problems. with good restful hypermedia APIs, we'd all get costumes together. We call it maybe a club, no, an academy. Be an API academy maybe, right? No? Am I kind of going over a little too far on this? Did I go? Then I figured, we'd just retire to a wonderful place here in France where the neighbors love me and my security cameras. No? Is it maybe not going to work out? I really kind of committed to this. I didn't really prepare a lot of other talk. I was kind of hoping we'd all just, experience. Well, maybe we'll have to see if I can come up with a few things instead. So this was actually one of the slides from the talk in 2012, where we were talking about standing on the shoulders of giants, or the 50 years of previous APIs. We talked about all these individuals who influenced us today. I won't mention every single one of them. You could probably find my talk somewhere here, but Vannevar Bush talked about the idea about the way people think and make connections. Ted Nelson gave us the hyperlink. Doug Engelbart gave us the mouse, the clicker. That's Christopher Alexander, who gives us the notion of patterns in software. Roy Fielding, and then I mentioned Ryan Dahl talked about Node. Node.js 10 years ago was teaching us this notion of asynchronous programming. And Rich Hickey giving us Clojure and Datomic. And then I threw in a little extra character here. This is Eric Schweikert. Has anybody heard of Eric? Probably not, because Eric actually builds toys for children. And what Eric had built 10 years ago and is still doing today are these little components, these magnetic components, where you assemble them together and they make a robot. You don't have to know anything about programming. You don't have to know anything about electronics. You just have to know that they magnetize together and they have their own little robot nature, which is what we're still doing today, right? We're talking about no code and low code. We're talking about components. Eric was talking about this 10 years ago, and he's teaching that to children today. One of the themes of the talks that I give over and over again is to remember the past so that we don't repeat it. That's why my talks very often have to do with history, because there's so much in the past that we can learn from so that we don't make the same mistakes. By 2013, I had expanded this list to include people from more than 50 years ago. Boole and Babbage, Ada Lovelace. Babbage and Ada Lovelace were the first hardware programmer team 150 years ago. Ada Lovelace complained that remote work really stunk. She hated it. She had to program Babbage's machine by sending letters. 150 years ago, we were complaining about remote work. And Alan Turing is a big thing now, because Alan had this idea about how computers might be perceived by humans as another human. Of course, we have ChatGPT and so many things today. Graham Bell and the idea of the mechanical Turk, the people behind the technology, actually plugging in all of the phone lines today. On all these other characters that we talked about earlier. Even back so far is Sir Patrick Geddes, up in the top corner. Sir Patrick Geddes gave us this notion. He's got this great quote that he said, a city is not just a location in space, it is also a drama in time. Cities are where people live and breathe. Complex systems where people are very, very important. And that's also very important for us as API developers to think about the complex systems we're creating. They live in time, and they live in time and space. JCR Licklater down in the corner with the glasses that sort of look like my glasses. JCR Licklater funded the very first ARPANET, which becomes the internet later on. And he thought a great deal about what he called the intergalactic computer network. He thought about the notions about, in the 1960s, what happens when we meet up with aliens from another planet, or the alien spacecraft, or the alien satellite. How will we communicate? And it's because of the way he thought about communications that we have things like control languages on the network. And that's because of JCR Licklater. And in the center is another individual, Paul Ottley. 100 years ago, Paul Ottley was thinking about how we would take audio and visual and text and create a network where people could call up on demand, what he called the worldwide network, before Tim Berners-Lee had actually implemented the World Wide Web. Almost 100 years ago, people were thinking about this. So one of the things that we discover over the years is our footprint, the influences that we have are vast. They go over 100 years. One of the really important talks in 2015 was this talk about how even though we have this beautiful technology that lets anybody do anything, anywhere, anytime, and connect to anyone else, we keep falling into these areas where there's a single hub of information like Twitter and Facebook and WordPress and Google Docs. If they go down, everyone goes down. That was this notion of centralization as a danger. And look at where we are today. We're experiencing the crash of some centralized services, and then we're losing friends. Back then, we talked about the notion of node all the things, be a node and not a hub. Figure out ways to expand your reach. Figure out ways to syndicate information but not become captive from it. And that allowed me to introduce another theme over and over again. Those who ignore the mistakes of the future are bound to make them. It's like Santayanas, but in reverse. We can see things coming at us. We can see bad things on the way. We can see new opportunities. If we're going too fast, we might even miss the turn. That's how you make the mistakes of the future. You forget and you don't pay attention. And that's a really important thing for us. Those of us who are building APIs today, we are affecting the future. We are affecting not just the next 10 years, but the 10 years after that and the 10 years after that. What we do today can make the world better or exacerbate the problems that we have. And it's important that we don't make the mistakes of the future as well as the mistakes of the past. And that means by the time we get to 2016, we were talking about how our APIs affect others on the planet. And we were focusing on this notion of the end of work, how automation and robotics in our APIs, the very work that a lot of us do here today, can put people out of work, can put strain on governments, strain on tax bases, strain on earnings. That's the work that we're doing. We're responsible for what happens to the world now. APIs are everywhere, more than they ever were 10 years ago. That means that we have the opportunity to make changes in lots of ways. And we talked about how to think about APIs as autonomic, not just automatic. Autonomic systems balance each other. Flight or fight versus rest and digest. This notion of coming up with both inputs and outputs. We tend to write systems that just go from the start to the end and then fall off the ledge. That's not how life works. Life is a circle, right? We talk about the circle of life on Disney cartoons. That is our life. That is our APIs as well. What we create as inputs become outputs for something else. Those outputs become inputs for someone else. Designing systems that are autonomic is how we get past the robot problems that we have today. We need to make them a circle. Donella Meadows says it really, really well, and she said it in 1972. It's still good today. Running the same system harder or faster will not change the pattern. We have to change how we think about what we do with APIs. We can't just do more of them. More isn't the answer. Better is the answer. Different is the answer. And even more specifically, this idea of the seventh generation, the great law of the Iroquois, when they made a decision, they said, we are deciding for the seventh generation beyond us, not just the next generation, or the next, the 7 generations ahead of us. The APIs that we create today are going to affect people 100 years from now. Stuart Brand, who's a great futurist and thinker, says that this very moment today was at one point in the past the unthinkable future. We are living in the unthinkable future. We are creating the future for so many other people. Keeping this great Iroquois law in mind is really important. So by the time, this was from just a couple of years ago, by the time I was giving this talk, I was including not just technologists, but past US presidents, economic advisors, all sorts of people from all sorts of walks of life. Because what we do affects all walks of life everywhere. Your job, your family, your travel, how we get here, how we communicate with each other online, how we communicate in person, all of these things. Even up in the far corner, H.G. Wells. H.G. Wells really had a love for bicycles. H.G. Wells at the turn of the century thought the bicycle was going to be the technology that made everyone equal, because you don't need a horse, you don't need the expense of training a horse, you don't need the expense of an automobile, you could use a bicycle. And I thought that was just so amazing, because Steve Jobs always talked about the bicycle effect of computers. that you pedal, you can get on your own, and that you can create a whole new world all on your own with a computer. So we have that opportunity to create a world all on our own, using the influences and the memories and the ideas and the futures that all of these people thought of in the past. So here's the challenge. What's coming at us now? What is it that we have seen over the last 10 years that we will see over the next 10 years that could sort of surprise us or maybe give us a great opportunity? Well, there are lots of things that I want to talk about, some from some past talks, but I also want to point ahead, just as we were talking about earlier. So programming the network and domain-specific languages and bots and AI and systems thinking and all that, then down to that final one on the bottom, the Fediverse, right? These are all very, very important items. So I've talked about this before. We're going to have to rethink orchestration. Remember I talked about this idea of autonomic, how things go in circles. We need to think of orchestration as part of a system, not as a specific element. When we think about workflow, we need to think about how workflow circles back and affects each other. Today, IFT and Zapier and Microsoft Flow and Google and AWS, they all have those things. This is also what no-code and low-code is going to look like as well. We need to rethink orchestration. And one of the ways we're going to rethink the way machines communicate is I think we're going to see a lot more domain-specific languages in the future. We're going to see language that are designed specifically to allow machines and humans to talk about a single topic, like GDPR or HIPAA services, or buy-in for banking, or FHIR for health, or Accord for insurance, and on and on and on. Sorry, I got excited. All of these things are going to let us speak in very different ways. We've had this whole wave of computer languages that became more and more general, Rust and C and all these other languages. We're going to start finding domain-specific languages powerful again. Think today about how you could use a domain-specific language to talk about your organization and your company. You already use that. We talk about it as ubiquitous language or domain-driven design. That's how we're going to build languages today. And just as I was talking about years ago, and for years to come, be very wary of chatbots. Be very wary of AI and automated speech. It is not a safe place for lots and lots of reasons. The latest toy that everyone is talking about is GPT Chat, right? How many people have actually tried out GPT Chat? Of course, right? That's what you do. GPT Chat is actually the very same programs that we were talking about 10 years ago with Eliza and Perry. Our AI bots, our chat bots, are great at mimicking human paranoid schizophrenics. That's what Perry does. They're lousy at mimicking healthy, thinking, generous human beings. When you unleash a bot, you're basically unleashing a paranoid schizophrenic on the rest of the world. You can get GPT Chat and any other chat to lie and cheat and steal and do all those things that we don't like very, very easily. GPT Chat loves to please you. It will do anything to please you, including lie about whether or not it knows what something is. Just ask it. So chatbots are dangerous. Be very, very wary. Instead, think about applying that domain-specific languages to what I've been talking task-focused micro-worlds. Little worlds where all we talk about is insurance, or all we talk about is health, or all we talk about is banking. And remember that computers are great at discovering, they're terrible at deciding. Don't use computers to make a decision. One of the watchwords at IBM all through the 60s, 70s, and 80s was a computer can never be held responsible, therefore it should never make a decision. And that is still right today. Computers are not for deciding. Computers are for informing you, collecting information for you that you couldn't collect from sources that you may not be able to connect to, but the computer can. Then you decide. Humans decide. Build systems that allow computers to collect and inform, and then let humans decide. Now, on the subject of artificial intelligence, I'm going to call out two people that I think are very, very important that you need to continue to pay attention to. Melanie Mitchell, who's designed lots of computer systems, thinking systems, focuses on the notion of how can we get a computer to understand a joke, irony? How do we get computers to actually think like humans? Because humans don't think in sequential bits and bytes. So Melanie Mitchell is a very important person to keep track of. And Joy Bolamwini has talked about this idea of coded bias and the danger in code. And she's really focused on the notion of what can happen when we try to allow computers to decide things. Decide who gets a loan, decide who gets hired, decide who gets into school. Always bad, and will be for a very, very long time, generations to come. If we apply the law of the Iroquois, we will not let computers decide. Now, there's a few other things that I wanted to call out specifically that I think have a lot to do with the kinds of experiences we've been having in the last year or two and how that will affect us in the future. We need to refocus on systems thinking. I was talking about Donella Meadows earlier. In 1972, 50 years ago, she helped us sort of establish the notion of systems thinking. We get most of the climate change maps and all the other things from Donella's team. Another person who's doing incredible work in this space is Ruth Malin. Ruth teaches courses in systems thinking and leadership in technology, and it's really worth paying attention. She's got this great collection called the Architecture Principles, where she collects things from all across the world and all across different disciplines to talk about systems thinking. If you have not read this, read this. You can get this for free. Take a course from Ruth and Dana Breedemeyer. They're a fantastic team that teach a lot about systems thinking. We need to think in these autonomic systems. Another thing that I'm going to mention is team topologies. How many people have heard or have read team topologies? Team topologies came on the scene 3 years ago and really just blew everyone away. They really give us, Matt Skelton and Manuel Pais give us this ability to talk about how teams interact with each other. One of the key elements of their team topologies is a team API, the way you communicate with a team and how you establish that communication. But what I find really fascinating, even though Skelton and Pais had really designed this to talk about technology or digital-facing teams, I'm seeing it show up in hospitals, doctor's office, lawyers' offices, accounting offices, all sorts of other places where individual teams with some form of autonomy, need to navigate the space of change. I love their notion about optimizing the flow of change. So if you haven't read this book, if you haven't seen them speak, please dig into this. You might notice on the book cover, the foreword was written by Ruth Malin, which I think is perfect, because both Ruth and Skelton and Pais are talking about this idea of how people are part of the system. Now, of course, the very new stuff, the Fediverse. How many people have heard of Fediverse, heard this word or seen this word? This is actually the sort of the new replacement theory. This is the new idea about how we might replace Twitter with these things called federated services based on a protocol called ActivityPub. Evan Prodmuro has really been working on this ActivityPub idea for more than 10 years, almost 15 years. This is not something new. He's talked about this. He's helped create other services like social media, like Identica and Statusnet, is now working on Pump.io. If you haven't read the ActivityPub material, check it out. At the same time, Yugen Ruchko created a product called Mastodon. Who's heard of Mastodon before? Mastodon is really a combination of ActivityPub and WebFinger and several other things. It's been around for several years. When I was talking about the notion of being a node and not a hub, Pomodoro had already written and released Identica, but we were still a few years away from Mastodon. We were sort of right in that middle spot. So this is a really important inflection point where we're talking about a distributed kind of Twitter, a distributed kind of Facebook that's not owned by corporations but is owned by people. You can start your own server if you want to. This is a huge opportunity and turning point for us. So this is a great time to revisit Tim Berners-Lee's Solid, this idea of shared data storage, not just shared activity, but shared data storage. And we're using RSS again. RSS is 20 years old, but it's a wonderful technology. The thing that ties all of these together is they're not owned by any one person. They're open source. That's what we need to be focusing on. So this thing called the Fediverse, it's already here. There are dozens of applications that are already built as part of this Fediverse that connect things together in various ways. So whether it's you on a Twitter or a YouTube or an Instagram or a Facebook or a Reddit or a Goodreads or a Tumblr, there's a Fediverse version of this out there somewhere that you can take advantage of. However, I'm very excited about the future, but I'm a little bit worried. Some of this should look pretty familiar. Do you remember this? Does anybody remember AOL? Was anybody ever on AOL? Remember when AOL fell over and the World Wide Web was going to be the distributed way that we do everything? That was exciting 20 years ago. What did that turn into? That turned into hubs of information. That turned into corporations taking advantage, using their weight to create places where we went and they monetized us, right? Now we have the Fediverse and we have Mastodon. We have another opportunity. While some of these corporate structures start to tumble, we have another opportunity to build something where everyone can be treated fairly and equally. What will happen next? Will we build another corporate infrastructure for people to create billionaires? Or will we do something different? Now, I don't think Mastodon will ever be as big as Twitter. Twitter has like 300 million users. Mastodon now has maybe a couple of million, just in the last couple of months. The server that I'm on has over 200,000 members. That's way too many members on a free and open server. It should be more like a couple of thousand. There are maybe 10,000 Mastodon servers out there, and that's just one of the various possibilities. But we need to make sure that we think about what we're doing next, and we don't end up getting corralled into another place where somebody else makes a lot of money. We need to not make the mistakes of the future. We need to not repeat the past. We have lots and lots of opportunity. We need to take advantage of it. So, in the meantime, while we're doing that, you can join me on Mastodon. You can join me in PixelFed, which is sort of like Instagram. You can join me on Goodreads, the Goodreads equivalent called Bookworm. I would love to connect with you. I would love to learn about what you're doing and what's interesting to you and how things might change in the future. Now, you know, there are lots of possibilities ahead of us. There was a time when television was really just coming into its own in the 1960s. And in the United States, Edward R. Murrow gave this speech about how television could change society. He said that it can enlighten, it can inform, it can engage, it can teach, but only if it's built to do that, only if that is the effort put into it. Otherwise, it's nothing but wires and lights in a box. And that's the same choice that we have too. The Fediverse, the internet, all these things can inform and enlighten and encourage and enable and empower, but only if it's actually built and applied to do that. Otherwise, it is just lights and wires. So part of our job as API developers is to make sure we're not just putting lights and wires in a box, that we're actually moving things forward, thinking about the law of the Iroquois, thinking ahead. If we focus on profits instead of people, we'll make the same mistakes as the past. If we focus on control rather than collaboration, we will make the mistakes of the future. More than anything else, we have an opportunity to follow that law of the Iroquois, to think about generations ahead. And that's what I really want to encourage you today. That's what I get excited about, and that's why I love coming to this event more than anything else, because those of us here, we are creating the future. We are creating the next decades. And it is such an honor to be able to talk with you and meet with you over these next couple of days. And I'd love to hear about what you're working on and what you're doing. So, you know, I've been thinking a lot about the fact that that time travel thing didn't work. I was really kind of counting on it. And maybe I had it wrong. Maybe Clooney was not my Hollywood doppelganger. You know, maybe that's going a little too far. Maybe it's more like Tom Hanks. Maybe I'm a Tom Hanks kind of character. Whatever that is, I just want to say that I've enjoyed speaking with today. Thank you very, very much. Come and see me over the next couple of days, and let's build the future together. Thank you very much. Thanks.